Hello and welcome back. This is the week 11 lecture. So today we're going to cover Herman Melville, at least as much as we can in a single week. So we're just talking about Benito Cereno and the Encantadas. Melville is obviously an important part of the American Renaissance, which we talked about last week. He obviously plays a large role. He's a central member in that movement or that group that would be identified about 100 years later by F.O. Matheson and those other early scholars of American literature. So we know who Melville is in a general sense. I think much like Poe and Hawthorne, he's one of these authors, in large part because they've been canonized for so long, we're already familiar with them, at least in passing. So, sort of like we talked about with Poe and The Raven, or Hawthorne and The Scarlet Letter, even if you haven't read those texts, you've probably heard of them. You're probably at least somewhat familiar with what they're about. The same goes for Moby Dick. That's obviously Melville's most famous work. Even if you haven't read it, you are somewhat aware of it because it really has permeated our popular culture, our popular consciousness. So you don't have to read it to know what it's about. You might be at least passingly familiar with Ahab and Ishmael and maybe Queequeg and obviously the white whale. There's all kinds of references to it in pop culture, and much like The Raven, we don't have to sit down and read it in order to get some of those references. If we just have a basic idea of what it's about, maybe some of the characters, we're sort of going to get the joke. So Melville does live on, not in quite the same way that Poe does. Melville does not have that same kind of larger-than-life, eccentric persona that kind of exists separately from his actual literature. We talked about the Poe effect and how that's contributed to Poe's afterlife. Melville, I think, is mostly remembered for Moby Dick, and some people might recall at some point hearing or reading that Melville died in obscurity. He was not super famous or successful during his lifetime, and really his career ended long before he died. So, yeah, he worked at the Custom House in New York, and, some people might know that about him. And, there's even, I think, an apocryphal story that his name was misspelled in his obituary. That's actually not true. I don't think it's true, but the fact that he died in obscurity is very much true. So that is kind of part of the legend, and we might remember that even if we don't know much else or if we haven't read really any of his work. So obviously we can't tackle Moby Dick in this class. We don't have time. One of these days I would love to teach it. I think it would be incredibly difficult to teach it. I've only ever read it and had it taught to me. I've never actually tried to teach it in a class. I think you would have to devote an entire class to it, really. I mean, it would take us so long to read the book. I think it would have to be pretty much our exclusive focus. But instead, because we're only spending 1 week on Melville, we're going to take a look at some of the shorter works. But these are two really well-known texts. Benito Cereno is one of his sort of most celebrated, appreciated works of shorter fiction. Some might call it a novella. Some might call it a very long short story, but it's certainly not quite at the level of a novel. And then we have the Encantadas, kind of a loosely assembled or collected group of sketches, little short stories, short pieces. Not all of them even have a super coherent narrative running through them. Some do. Some are a little bit more meditative and contemplative and not quite as narrative, but they're all sort of loosely joined based on setting, based on certain motifs. So it's a nice little short story collection that we can tackle in a relatively short amount of time. So we have 10 sketches. Try to get through all of them. I've given you a link. It's not the best way to read them, honestly. I don't think online. I wish I could get you what I have here in this anthology with the footnotes. I just wasn't able to assemble a scanned version. So we'll just use this online version. And if you can't get through all of the sketches, it's not the end of the world. Just read as much as you can. Definitely finish Benito Cereno. Cereno will be more heavily featured on our final exam. So make sure you read it all. And you might need to read it twice. The Encantadas, I'll spend a little bit less time on them, and again, I'm assuming that we might not all finish them, but read as many as you can. They're fun, and they're a little bit lighter, I think, than some of Melville's other texts. So I do want to get into a little bit of bio on Melville today. Not a ton. We don't typically do a whole lot of biographical stuff, but his life is a sort of interesting mirror, I think, in a lot of ways to his literature. And I just want to talk a little bit about his career, sort of his rise and fall. And I also want to use him as a transition so we can go back and talk about some things that we really should have talked about a couple of weeks ago when I was discussing Washington Irving. So I want to go back in time a little bit, talk about some other writers briefly. I promise this will make sense. I will connect this back to Melville, but I want to go back to a slightly earlier period and talk about the development of the frontier romance novel, or just sort of this genre in general. It mostly showed up in novels, later a little bit maybe in short fiction, but this became a popular genre of the early American novel in the early decades of the 19th century. So when we were talking about Irving recently, I mentioned that he sort of rose to prominence in the 1820s, and he became our first literary celebrity, our first literary export to other countries. But there was another important figure that we didn't really get into who was active at around that same time. Comes a little bit later than Irving, but they're very much contemporaneous. They're writing from many of the same decades. I think I mentioned him in passing, but we have to go back and talk about him and the genre a little bit more. So James Fenimore Cooper is a name, again, that we might be familiar with if you know Last of the Mohicans, if you know the leather stocking character, a little bit like Melville. Maybe you haven't read that stuff, but maybe you've heard some of those names. Perhaps you saw the movie version of Last of the Mohicans, which I strongly recommend. It came out in the early 90s, directed by Michael Mann, starring Daniel Day-Lewis. He was already a pretty famous actor by the time he did that, but that really made him a huge star in the U.S. I remember watching it in theaters as a child. It's a really good movie. I mean, they change a lot about the book, and that bothers people, but they keep some of the really iconic elements, that really essential frontier hero prototype in Leatherstocking. That's really the centerpiece of the movie, and it's what Cooper is most remembered for, the Leatherstocking character. He wrote a whole series of books featuring this character. So we'll talk a little bit more about that character in a moment, but just keep in mind, keep Cooper in mind as a major architect of the frontier romance genre. We should be a little bit familiar with this genre, at least its early sort of origins, because we read Edgar Huntley. So I wouldn't necessarily say that Brown was consciously working within a frontier romance genre. I don't think the genre quite existed in a really coherent, well-articulated form when Brown was writing. But a lot of the elements that we saw in Edgar Huntley, the violence, the Native American conflict, the interest in geography, the emergence of Huntley as this sort of proto-action hero, this guy who goes from being sort of a mild-mannered, bookish sort to suddenly, he's John Wayne or he's Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's killing people. He's jumping into rivers. He's running away from gunfire. It's the the stuff of action movies. Now, of course, Brown's a little clunky and awkward in the way he handles all of that, but as I mentioned weeks ago, that's one of the reasons we're still so interested in Edgar Huntley, is because it helps to sort of set some of these templates for future action fiction and future westerns. And Cooper really accelerates that process. And Cooper's a little bit more aware, I think, of what he's doing. And he's very not that Brown's not aware of what he's doing, but Cooper's just more aware of genre. And as we progress, he comes a couple decades later, again, about 2.5 decades after Brown. Cooper starts writing his frontier romances in the 1820s. He also writes some nautical adventure. He has a novel called The Red Rover, which features pirates. That might put us in mind of what we're going to talk about later with Melville, also writing in the nautical adventure vein. So these books are all related, right? These are adventure stories. We're familiar with the basic concept, but just know that along with sentimental fiction and some of these other examples that we've been looking at, some early works of Gothic stuff, we also have adventures, frontier romances as a popular genre of novels in early U.S., on the U.S. literary scene at this early point. So Cooper's a big part of it, but other writers work within this genre as well. So last week I mentioned Lydia Maria Child and her novel Hobomok, which also came out in the 1820s, another frontier romance with Native Americans playing a large role. I might have mentioned this book, I don't think I did, Hope Leslie by Catherine Maria Sedgwick, another frontier romance. I believe it was maybe 1830s. I've actually taught this book before. No, I want to say 1827 maybe. I could easily look it up, but I don't want to take the time. But it's, that same general area, but I actually taught Sedgwick in my 416 class I want to say it was last year, on the literature of the early American Republic. If we had time for more frontier romance, I would want us to do it in here as well. It's a lot more interesting than a lot of Cooper's novels, honestly. I'm not a big fan of Cooper. That's why we don't read them. That's why I recommend the movie over the book version of Last of the Mohicans. But Sedgwick's making a lot of the same moves. Like Cooper, she's using our colonial past and westward migration, westward expansion as major topics, major sort of ideas for her literature. Now, she's setting her frontier romance in Puritan New England during one of their many, the early settlers' sort of early conflicts with Native Americans, but unlike Cooper, who was really quite racist in most of his portrayals of Native Americans, Sedgwick portrays her Native American characters with a pretty large degree of depth and nuance, and she makes some of them, a couple of them, pretty heroic in their own ways, and really the focus is on female characters in this novel, particularly, well, at least in part, a Native American female character. So it's a little innovative and certainly more progressive than Cooper. Cooper is operating in a slightly more old-fashioned vein. Again, the colonial past, Native American conflict on the frontier, a lot of the stuff that we saw in Brown. Another early influence, you guys might remember me talking about Benjamin Church back when we were discussing Bradstreet and some of those early Puritan writers. I mentioned Church as having been a soldier. He participated in King Philip's War, a really important conflict between the English settlers and Native Americans in New England during the 17th century, kind of helped turn the tide and establish the English permanently in that part of the world. And Church played a big role in the war. He later wrote a memoir, essentially. It kind of got collected by his son or his grandson, and he kind of becomes our first frontier hero. At least that's how historians and scholars sort of look at, literary scholars look at him now. He kind of provides these templates, kind of creates this character type that we see over and over again in American fiction. Like I said, we see it in all of these adventure stories, and then we see the character type near the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century in Westerns. We see this character type really personified in a lot of Westerns, both in terms of movies and novels. So Church is a very early example. He learns Native American sort of fighting techniques, later uses them against Native Americans, but in many ways he lives like a Native American. He has Native American allies who serve under him during the war, and if you actually read his memoir, they do most of the work. They kill most of the big head guys on the enemy side, and Church is really more in a managerial role. But again, he lives a little bit like them. He knows their ways, but he later uses that knowledge to help white settlers achieve conquest. And that's very much what Leatherstocking does in Cooper's novels. So in the same vein, obviously a fictional character, but the whole thing with Leatherstocking, and again, you know this if you've seen Last of the Mohicans, but he was raised by Native Americans. He is a white man born on the frontier of mid-18th century New York, sort of like the upstate of New York, where there was a pretty strong French presence that's not far from Quebec. So during the French-Indian War, which is the backdrop of Last of the Mohicans, takes place about a decade and a half or so before the American Revolution. A lot of American colonists were sort of unwilling or reluctant allies of the British as the British fought against the French. And the French's Native American allies basically for supremacy over North America. And as you probably know, the British won that war, and the French colonial presence really kind of evaporated largely in the U.S. They retained parts of Canada, but that was kind of the end of the major conflict between the British and the French in North America. So like I said, that's the historical setting for the novel. And Leatherstocking, he's raised by Native Americans, but he's a white man, a white Christian who knows the ways of the natives, but he is somewhat separate from them, as we are reminded throughout the narrative, because of his background and his Christianity. So he's raised by Chingachgook, an elderly Mohican man, along with Chingachgook's son, Uncas, and he's kind of like he's kind of like brothers with Uncas, but there is that important distinction that Cooper emphasizes a lot. But anyway, what's interesting about the novel version of Last of the Mohicans is that Leatherstocking is not exactly the hero in a traditional sense. See, what you have to understand about early frontier romances, they were very much using a kind of older model in terms of their narrative construction. They were very much indebted to chivalric medieval romances where you would have sort of noble characters, knights or lords, performing these heroic deeds, rescuing damsels and fighting dragons or whatever. So they were kind of using some of those prototypes. That they would usually have an aristocratic leading man. Somebody who was, well-born, maybe, an army officer or a count or something, I don't know. But somebody who was sort of noble and gentlemanly, that would typically be the protagonist. And then you would have more sort of rustic types, sort of more rough and tumble, working class type characters, if you will, who were often very important to the events of the plot, but they were sort of secondary. They were supporting characters. And that's kind of how Leatherstocking functions in some of the early novels featuring him. So there's a whole series of these that Cooper wrote over the course of the 1820s, 1830s, and into the 1840s. And early on, Leatherstocking's just kind of a really important supporting character. He's this really skilled marksman, a very good fighter. He kind of serves as a guide for a British officer who's trying to shepherd a couple of sort of young women, the daughters of an important commander, an important British military officer who's like a more superior officer. This guy's trying to get these young women to safety, and Leatherstocking is essentially essentially their guide, along with Uncas and Chingachgook. So, I mean, it's a good story. You got to give Cooper credit. It's a good story. It's sort of timeless and compelling. But in the novel, the British officer is the real hero. He's the one who gets the girl. He's the one who kind of occupies the traditional leading man role. And Leatherstocking is a little bit more of the sidekick, the supporting guy. He's kind of funny and eccentric. And the other white characters think he's really weird because he dresses like the Native Americans. He has their customs and their ways. He's lived in the woods, his whole life. So he's presented as very uncultivated, very uncultured, and that's kind of why he can't be the hero. That's how old-fashioned romances were from earlier eras, and that was still kind of the convention in early frontier romance. Again, and remember, at this point, we don't have the same kinds of definitions always for the types of books that we have now. So back then, a romance might have been distinguished from a novel. Like we've kind of said, novels were more associated with realistic fiction. So Hawthorne actually writes about this. He refers to a lot of his books as romances because they have supernatural elements and they're kind of fanciful. So remember, like an adventure or a frontier romance would have had those connotations, not the supernatural part so much, but the aristocratic hero, the adventure, the swashbuckling, saving women, fighting and killing bad guys, all of that. So it wouldn't have always been considered the same as a realistic novel. Now we refer to all of those as novels, but they had a slightly different terminology in the early 19th century. But anyway, Cooper's very instrumental in sort of popularizing this style in the U.S. He's not the only one doing it. Again, Sedgwick, Child, who are both better writers, and others too. So by the time Melville comes along, this is a well-established genre that's quite popular. And again, it's usually focused on the frontier and westward expansion. But what Melville does early in his writing career is he writes some nautical adventures in the 1840s called Typee and Omoo. And these are set in the South Pacific. They have a lot of the same features, a lot of the same elements that we've been describing, except the setting is now shifted from the forests and mountains of the U.S. to Tahiti and other exotic locations in the South Pacific that most U.S. readers would not have been familiar with. So early on, Melville achieved some success with these early nautical adventures. Like I said, Cooper wrote a nautical adventure or two. So this is kind of familiar terrain. These are, popular types of books. And Melville does meet with some early critical and commercial success. But as many of us probably already know, I've already kind of mentioned this, his success dries up and his career really ends pretty early. He does not meet with much success when he publishes some of his most famous work. So, we don't read his early nautical romances anymore. Instead, we read Moby Dick, maybe Bartleby and Benito Cereno, some of his more famous short fiction, maybe The Confidence Man, which is one of his most celebrated novels. But none of those books were popular when they came out. And not only were they not popular with the general public, but they were not well received by critics either. So by the time the Civil War is over, by the second half of the 1860s, Melville's career is over. And he takes a job at the New York Customs House. He's a customs inspector. The Deputy Inspector of Customs was his official job title. He was still writing, but he didn't really publish. In the final 25 years or so of his life, he was very obscure. Yeah, he really became completely unknown, was forgotten. Had never gotten all that famous to begin with, but he did publish a fair amount of short fiction and periodicals throughout the 1850s. So, people in the literary scene knew who he was, at least for a while. But again, he was never very successful, even less so than Hawthorne, who at least had a pretty good critical reputation, even though he didn't sell a ton of copies. And, but for Melville, his career was over by the late 1860s. And he was forgotten for decades. It is interesting, though, he was always a little bit more appreciated overseas. Like, they liked him in England, a little bit like Poe, who was always held in high regard by a lot of French critics, and even some poets and other writers in France kind of helped to revive Poe. In the early 20th century, even really going back to the late 19th, something similar happens with Melville. He gets kind of rehabilitated or rediscovered, and he kind of enjoys an interesting afterlife, of course, well after his death. So he dies in the 1890s. Again, he's writing up until the end of his very long life, but he wasn't really publishing. So after he died, some of his unpublished manuscripts, including Billy Budd, they were published posthumously. And people started reading them, got interested in them, and then we decided, okay, let's go back to some of his other work that was kind of critically reviled and ignored or even ridiculed when it came out. I mean, not all of it was received that badly. Moby Dick probably was. Some of his short fiction did a little bit better, but basically after his early adventure novels, nothing else that he wrote was wildly successful. So in the story that we tell about him now, we kind of, look at this a little bit like his life story. He starts out with success and a lot of potential and promise, and then things sort of turn. They take a turn for the worse. That kind of happened in his biography as well. So he was born in New York City to a pretty illustrious family with really deep roots on both sides. His mom and dad, his dad, I believe, I want to get this right, his dad was originally from, his family was originally from New England, but they were of French stock. They originally had come over from France. I think they were French Huguenots, like Protestant French immigrants, and they had deep roots in New England. They were wealthy merchants, I think, for many generations. And then Melville's mother came from a wealthy Dutch family, an old New York Dutch family, exactly what Irving was describing in his fiction. So that was very much her background. She's actually from an area very close to Tarrytown. And Irving wrote about that area as well. So, pretty deep roots, a lot of affluence on both sides of his family. But when he was around 12 or 13, his father, who had already blown most of the family's money, died, leaving the family in a good bit of financial distress. So Melville had to quit school and basically go to work. So he was an adolescent, and that was essentially the end of his formal education. He worked for a number of years, and then when he was still a young man, maybe 20, 21, he signed up as a sailor on a whaling vessel bound for the South Pacific, and he went to sea. So he used a lot of his experiences as a sailor when he wrote those early nautical adventures, and also when he wrote Moby Dick. He set a lot of his fiction at sea, even Benito Cereno, another example. And he visited the Galapagos Islands, at least briefly, as a sailor. So he's drawing on those experiences with the Encantados. So like I said, after that early success, he starts pursuing his own interests, which aren't necessarily those nautical adventures. He's not a conventional writer, so he does not really want to continue in that sort of romance, frontier, adventure type style. So he's got interest in a lot of fields, and we know that Melville was a pretty brilliant guy. I mean, he was largely self-taught. Again, didn't have the kind of formal education that a Poe had or Hawthorne, both of whom went to university. I mean, Poe didn't graduate, but he did attend the University of Virginia, and I think Hawthorne went to Bowdoin, like an elite private institution in Maine. So unlike them, Melville was largely self-taught, but was extremely well-read, extremely knowledgeable in a lot of fields: theology, sort of early psychology, history, Did I say? I think I led with theology. Very, very knowledgeable about the Bible. Tons of biblical references and allusions in a bunch of his works. Also, loved Shakespeare. Of course, was very well read in the classics. Had a great breadth of literary knowledge. But yeah, all these different fields: history, philosophy. Particularly interested in metaphysics, which is typically we call that, or we use that term to refer to a branch of philosophy sort of interested in like first principles of things, or really abstract concepts such as being and knowing and substance and time. So he was interested in all of that, and he didn't view the conventional sort of adventure novel as really the best avenue to pursue those interests. So he starts writing different stuff, weird stuff, darker, denser, more difficult, full of allusions, and interested in a lot of those preoccupations, and that's Moby Dick, right? That comes out in 1851. It's not well received. In fact, a lot of people actively hated it. And if you've ever read it or tried to, it's really long, and there is a clear narrative, and there's some moments of really exciting action and interesting character development. But part of what makes it so difficult is so much stuff is packed in there. And Melville will take frequent breaks from the main thrust of the narrative, which is, they're chasing the whale. We basically know that narrative, but he takes long breaks from it to talk about whaling, or something from the Bible, or a color, or some other like tangent. And again, he's indulging his interests in theology, philosophy, history. He tells you everything you ever would want to know about the whaling industry, but also different kinds of whales. He's interested in biology. He's interested in the oceans. He's interested in geography. And we have entire chapters where we're not getting the narrative. We're just getting stuff on whales or history or something else. And that can be frustrating, for many readers. But if you just sort of embrace the messiness of it all and the expansiveness of it all, it's really quite impressive. The degree of the amount of knowledge he accrued, the degree to which he can jump around with all of these different threads and still manage to sort of keep it together. I mean, these are some of the things that we admire in Melville today. Part of the reason he has been brought to the forefront in more recent times is we appreciate certain techniques and methods that he was using, and a lot of those were not necessarily appreciated during his lifetime back in the 19th century. So a lot of people would, describe Melville as very dense, dense as in there's a lot packed into his prose, a lot to unpack. He can often be ambiguous. I'm sorry if you guys can hear there's somebody with a leaf blower outside my window. I don't know if you can hear that, but I definitely can. Melville is often ambiguous. He's often somewhat playful and witty. We don't always pick up on that because his language can be a chore. He himself can be a chore. Like I said, he is ambiguous, and much like Hawthorne, he will sometimes deceive us. He's very interested in the whole nature of knowledge, the limits of knowledge, the limits of human reason. Brown was also interested in that stuff. Again, that kind of got handed down from the English Romantics, those poets in the early 1800s, this kind of pushback against certain Enlightenment ideals about the power of human reason and rationality, and this idea that the human mind is a machine and we can understand anything if we just study it enough. Melville complicates that. Melville likes riddles. Melville likes puzzles. He likes seemingly inexplicable events. He likes natural phenomena. Again, sort of like Brown, things that seem to defy human reason, things that go beyond our ability, our understanding. So he's interested in all of that. He's also interested in, like I said, history, psychology, theology, very well schooled in the Bible. So you get all of that in Moby Dick. It was a failure, but now we look at it, and some people call it somewhat postmodern. If you guys are, familiar with what's often considered to be postmodern fiction, it's got a lot of different elements. It's kind of self-referential, kind of commenting on the nature of storytelling itself. Melville definitely does that. Melville calls attention to sort of the artificiality of stories. It's very self-referential. And again, postmodern literature will often have this other stuff. It's sometimes called sort of pastiche, this idea of like kind of bringing together different elements. And it's often writers who are very familiar with certain conventions and formulas. Like if you read Pynchon or, even David Foster Wallace, these guys who are often called postmodern, sort of late 20th century novelists, they do that. Like they show that they really know the detective genre formula. And then they play around with it. They subvert it. They call attention to the formula. They call attention to the artificiality of some of it. And then they'll break away and they'll do some weird thing for a couple of chapters that seems unrelated. That's all very much like what Melville does. So now, part of the reason he's taken on such a bigger role, such a larger sort of role in our literature in the 20th century, after he died, is because we now recognize him as being perhaps ahead of his time, modern in certain ways, in ways that wouldn't have really played well in the middle of the 19th century, but by the middle of the 20th century and the end of the 20th century, they look like techniques and strategies that we see quite a bit. They don't seem so out of left field. And we appreciate the artistry. We appreciate the breadth of knowledge and all the different registers that he can work in. But, a lot of scholars have made the case that there's really two Moby Dicks. I know we're not reading it, so I'll move on quickly here, but there's kind of two halves that were later brought together and made into a whole. So they say that on one hand, Melville just kind of wrote a straightforward adventure story, very much like Typee and some of his earlier stuff. Just a straightforward adventure tale set on the whaling vessel. They're chasing the whale, they're fighting the whale's eating guys, boats are getting destroyed, and a lot of that's there. I mean, there is a lot of thrilling action in the novel. But that was one half, and then he wrote this more metaphysical half, where he's, again, exploring all of these other things and complicating a lot of his narrative threads. He'll have chapters where Ishmael is at a different point in time talking to different people about different stuff. And then there's all the chapters on whales and God knows what else. And eventually what Melville did was he brought those two halves together and created the novel that we know today. So some critics claim that if he had just stuck with the original adventure story that he had, maybe he could have been successful. But of course we appreciate what he did now. But anyway, if we just kind of wrap up our bio, then we'll get to our text, Benito Cereno and the Encantadas. But he does have a sense of humor. I just want to wrap up a brief description of Melville as a writer, because again, he's not to everyone's taste. Let's just put that out on the table. Some find him very interesting, inventive. Again, he likes riddles, and if you remember, My Kinsman Major Molyneux, he's doing a lot of the same things as Hawthorne. The two of them were friends, and they reviewed each other's work. They were pen pals, correspondents. They wrote to each other a lot, and they shared a lot of traits as writers. And really, one of the things Matheson and other scholars discovered when they were creating the American Renaissance category is that a lot of the guys of this era, a lot of the guys in this group, Poe, Hawthorne, Melville, they're all interested in some of these same metaphysical concerns, these things about nature, these things about knowledge, these things about time and space, the limits of human knowledge. That shows up in a lot of their work. And a certain degree of ambiguity is there with Poe, with Hawthorne, and we see it again with Melville. But I really think Melville and Hawthorne are similar in that they like the puzzle. They like to confound readers sometimes. They will deceive us. They want us to read between the lines and kind of figure it out for ourselves. So there's a great quote from Melville. He kind of had his own theory of literature and writing, and he claimed that a true writer would always write for two different audiences. So on one hand, you had the audience comprised of the mob, and that was just the term that he used, I think, to refer to the general reading public. And he claimed that, they didn't read all that closely. But obviously, they're the ones that are going to probably, determine whether or not the book is commercially successful. But then you have the other audience, the other group. He described them as the eagle-eyed readers who perceive the true meaning of those passages that the author has directly calculated to deceive, to egregiously deceive the superficial skimmer of pages. So he's saying the members of the mob, the members of the general reading public, they are just the skimmers of pages. They are not reading closely. They are not digging deep. But the eagle-eyed readers, they will be able to perceive the true meaning, the truth. And Melville says the truth can only be apprehended. He has another quote. He says the truth can only be understood or apprehended covertly and in brief snatches. So he kind of buries a lot of his real meanings or a lot of the true sort of versions of events. A lot of that will be buried in his text, and they can be easy to miss. He sort of wants us to figure it out, like we said, to read between those lines. And if you don't, if you're just skimming, if you're just reading casually, yes, you will be deceived. And Melville's making it clear that he is intentionally deceiving you. That's very much by design. But if you read closely, and I think this is true of Hawthorne too, if you read closely and if you read it multiple times, especially, you'll be able to figure it out. So we can see a lot of those traits on display in Benito Cereno. So if you guys want to take a look, my pagination is different, so I'm not going to be able to give you page numbers, but this is one of his most celebrated works of short fiction, and it's very much a riddle. Like I said, you might consider it a novella, maybe just a very long short story, but it's one of his best. And I can remember the first time I read it as an undergrad, just like my kinsman Major Molyneux, I did not understand it on my initial read-through. I had to go back, I had to try again, and I needed my professor to kind of help me out. So I will give away the ending eventually. Hopefully by now we've all figured it out. It is a little bit unclear and ambiguous throughout much of the story. This is very much a story about perception, about that difference, that distinction between perception and reality. It's about the limits of human knowledge. But on its surface, it can be read as a relatively straightforward narrative about an American sea captain's adventures on board a Spanish slaving vessel off the coast of Chile. That is what the story is about. And again, in the hands of a different author, or even earlier in Melville's career, I think we could probably see this functioning like a pretty traditional adventure story. So our hero in that case would be Captain Delano, who would show up, save the day, do some rescuing, do some fighting, do some death-defying deeds, and we would have a happy conclusion. We could definitely take the raw materials of this narrative and turn it into a pretty conventional action adventure story. But that is not what Melville is interested in doing. Instead, we have a slowly unfolding riddle that again is very much about perception and the nature of perception. In particular, the perception of Captain Delano. So, in addition to all of that, we also have to examine what the story has to say about race and slavery. So, for years, critics and scholars have been trying to figure out what exactly Melville is saying here. I think most people detect some level of political and social commentary here on the issues of race relations and slavery, to be more specific. But because Melville is so ambiguous, because there's so much to unpack here, there's often been uncertainty when it comes to figuring out what Melville's position is, or what the larger meaning or theme of the story really is. And I don't claim to know for certain. I've never talked to Herman. He's never revealed his secrets to me. I did study him a lot, more than any human would ever want to. And when I was a student, I'm very fond of him. I'm very fond of his work, but I don't claim to really know a lot about his political positions or his views on a lot of social issues. There's no evidence to say that he really supported slavery. He didn't own slaves, but I also wouldn't really call him an abolitionist either. He wasn't really vocal in the support of either cause. So it's a little unclear. I tend to think he was somewhat progressive in his views, but we don't have a lot of hard evidence for that. He didn't talk about it a lot. I think there's a lot of different ways to read this story. A lot of critics have read it as a repudiation of slavery and racial, discrimination, to put it mildly. But that's debatable. That's an open question. But it just depends on how we're going to read it, how we're going to read Delano, and how we're going to read the events that have transpired on board the San Dominic, this Spanish ship. So some critics have said, all right, well, yeah, ultimately it is a commentary. It is a sort of condemnation of slavery. But then other critics will say, well, maybe it is. That might be true. But because Melville is so ambiguous, we can't really tell. We can't really tell what his statement is, like what real commentary he's providing. Maybe he is anti-slavery, but it's not made clear in the text. And then other critics, especially earlier critics, earlier in the 20th century, they read it a little bit more along those conventional lines, where Delano becomes a hero, a sort of, traditional kind of adventure story protagonist, and, very intrepid, brave, honest, morally upright. He's there to save the day, and eventually, I guess, kind of does, from this certain perspective at least. Again, an earlier perspective, which was obviously deeply inflected with racism. And with that view, that early reading of the text often held that Babbo was sort of evil, kind of a personification of evil and deceit, and Delano was the hero there to put things right. I don't think we necessarily read it. Certainly not everybody reads it that way anymore. I think in the present day, we are much more inclined to question Delano and maybe be very skeptical about Delano. And I'm going to give us a few more reasons to be skeptical of him. We don't have to dislike him. I wouldn't call him a villain. I wouldn't say that he's secretly, the bad guy here. But we certainly need to be careful about the ways that we identify with him and his perception. Because as we will see, his perception of what's going on aboard this ship is very flawed, and he is mistaken about a lot of things. So we might view Babbo more favorably ultimately once we understand everything that has transpired. We might view Babbo as a more sympathetic character than Delano or certainly Don Benito. So we'll talk more about that as we move along. So a lot of shifting, a lot of debate has always surrounded this story. because it's Melville and because his intentions are not always clear, and also because there are different ways to read this story. And there are different ways to read the ending of this story and to try to figure out what Melville really wanted to say. But one thing we can definitely determine without any question is that Delano is wrong-headed about many things. So a lot like Edgar Huntley, and even a little bit like Robin, he is an unreliable guide. So only Huntley really functions as a true first-person narrator because he's kind of telling his own story in that long letter that he's writing his fiancée. But in the case of Robin and Delano, they're not telling their own stories. We don't get first-person point of view in these texts, but we as readers are largely aligned with the perspective of these characters. So in My Kinsman, a major reason why we're confused early in the story is because Robin is confused. So we are experiencing things largely as Robin experiences them. And it's only a little bit later on that readers can start to kind of figure it out maybe for themselves. And that's when you can start to get a little bit of distance between yourself and this wrong-headed character. And that's going to become very important in Benito Cereno. So when we first meet Delano, we're probably tempted to just go ahead and identify with him because he's clearly kind of the lead here. I mean, Don Benito's an important character, but none of the other characters get developed in much detail. It's really just the two of them. And of course, that's pretty typical in a work of relatively short fiction. We're not going to have a huge cast of well-developed characters like we would in a novel. So, okay, we largely have to identify with Delano, at least initially, and that means that we are perceiving things through his eyes. We are seeing things and understanding things the way that he is seeing and understanding. So when it comes to the Africans on board the ship, we see them initially as Delano sees them. But once we begin to realize that Delano might be wrong about certain things or Delano might be misapprehending things, that puts us in a very awkward position as readers because we've been identifying with this guy. We've kind of been taking him at his word, but now we have to start questioning things. We have to start examining previously held assumptions. But there are a couple of clues that Melville's narrator provides early on that should indicate to us that Delano might not be really maybe we shouldn't trust him or trust his perceptions 100%. So I'm sorry I don't have a page number here, but I do want to read a relatively brief passage to you guys, a couple of paragraphs. I'm about 30 pages in. So I don't know exactly what page that is for you, but in my edition, I'm about 30 pages into the text, beginning with the paragraph that starts with, "There is something in the Negro." Never a good sign if you're starting a sentence like that. So I want us to notice a few things here. The narrator is talking about Babbo here. Or we've just been observing Babbo as he sort of waits on Don Benito, or at least that's what we think is happening at this point in the narrative. So you guys probably know, if you've watched historical fiction, any kind of, period piece set in an earlier century, you know that in earlier eras, aristocrats, well-born people, wealthy people would have usually had servants sort of attending them at almost all times. So wealthy men in particular would have had a what was often called a valet or a body servant who basically just travels with them and just waits on them, throughout the day. So the valet would help the man shave and maybe bring his coffee in the morning, help him get dressed. They would travel together. The valet would carry the gentleman's bags and all that kind of stuff. So in Europe, by the 1850s, when this text is published, in Europe, slavery has been abolished by most Western European countries, so this role would be filled by servants, sometimes white, sometimes black, but not actual slaves. Of course, in the Americas, this type of role would be filled normally by slaves, generally African slaves. So that's what we're talking about at this point in the narrative. So the narrator is just sort of talking about African slaves in general and their talent for being valets or sort of body servants, their talent for tending to wealthy men, essentially. But I want us to notice all that's going on in this passage. I'm actually going to read it, so just bear with me. We start with the narrator just addressing us directly. And the narrator is just sharing some general observations which are going to strike any modern reader as very offensive, very stereotypical, and highly racist. And then we eventually are going to segue into the feelings and beliefs of Captain Delano. We're not getting Delano's actual words or voice. We're not getting directly into his head. Everything is still delivered by the narrator, but the narrator shifts from these general observations to then talking about Delano in particular. So I want us to notice that, because at this point, as ambiguous as he is, at this point, Melville is going to make it very plain, very clear, exactly how Delano feels about Africans, African Americans as well. And just as a quick preface before I read the passage, there were all these pseudo-scientific theories, floating around in the 19th century that were largely used as justifications for slavery. And I say pseudoscience because they've obviously all been debunked, but these were just various theories that would attempt to explain why Africans were inferior, or why any dark-skinned or black-skinned people were inferior to white-skinned people of European descent. So you had all kinds of different theories. I don't know a whole lot about them. I know that some people claimed that all humans descended from Adam and Eve, but some races became kind of degraded, or they degenerated over time, so they became inferior, but they were not inherently inferior, and they could perhaps be rehabilitated and put on equal footing with other races. But then there was another camp that said, no, there were actually different Adams and Eves, and these are all different species. So you would hear that a lot in the 19th century. Slavery apologists would say, look, Africans are a different species than white people. They are an inferior species. So that justifies our treatment of them. So I don't know how much Melville knew about those theories, or whether or not he subscribed to any of those theories. None of those are explicitly referenced here in the text. I don't know if Delano subscribes to any of those pseudo-scientific theories, but we're about to learn that he definitely thinks that Africans are inferior. So let's see here. This is about 30. Well, I'm sorry.